Hi everyone. It is my pleasure to be talking to you all in this course, the HIRA International Symposium and Training course, which is focusing on the COVID-19 pandemic, balancing a new normal by enhancing the healthcare system. My name is Somil Nagpal. I'm a senior health specialist with the World Bank, and I'm based in Jakarta. It's a pleasure once again. And the topic that we'll discuss today are the regional efforts to achieve UHC and the impact of COVID-19. I would like to acknowledge my colleagues, particularly Dr. Ajay Tandon and other colleagues mentioned on the slide, uh, from whom I have sourced a lot of the materials that will be presented today, and also to the JLN Domestic Resource Mobilization Collaborative. Thank you very much. Let's start. So we have now come into the SDG era, and one of the SDGs that we are all aspiring for is SDG 3 on good health and well being. And within that, the target 3.8 looks at UHC, so achieving universal health coverage with the coverage of essential health services and financial protection for all is now a target that we as a global community are aspiring for under the Sustainable Development Goals. So this may be a very familiar box for many of you, but just recapping our understanding of how the UHC concept looks like. So the UHC needs to be about covering everybody, giving them sufficient financial coverage, and giving them sufficient coverage in terms of the services available. So in that sense, these can be seen as three dimensions of a cube. If you can see the slide, there's a larger cube in terms of the total space that needs to be filled for adequate coverage of these dimensions. But the blue box within that is showing what is the current level of coverage. And as you can see, the population coverage is the breadth dimension here. How many people are covered out of how many who are eligible. The share of services covered is the depth dimension. What services are currently covered and what remain to be covered. And then the height dimension is what is still the financial cost that applies. What is the cost sharing fees? What are the incidental costs that are still being paid by people who are receiving these services? And to what extent can we do better in reducing uh, these payments and thereby improving the financial coverage as well? So these are the three dimensions, and we can expand the cube in any dimension which it will require more resources. The more blue color here is more and more resources that will be needed. So we can use that to expand this cube in any of the three directions altogether or incrementally as our resources allow and as per the country policy. So even before COVID, the global health financing landscape showed that there were large variations in total health expenditures. The health expenditure in countries such as Ethiopia or Burundi or Central African Republic or the Democratic Republic of Congo was just about $18 or $20 or in that range per capita, while this was almost $10,000 per capita in case of Norway, Switzerland, USA. So these are huge ranges that countries do in terms of spending on health per capita. And this has also a variation in the range of how much is it as a share of GDP, from as little as 2% of GDP in Monaco to as much as 18% of GDP in Marshall Islands. Uh, Out of this total health expenditure, the public expenditure for health was even smaller. And this ranged from less than $5 in Mozambique and Bangladesh, Central African Republic, DRC, and Afghanistan, as you can see in 2015, to almost US dollar 5,000 public health spending per capita in many of the European countries such as Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and Luxembourg. And this share of public health spending as a share of GDP also range from about 0.5% of GDP in Bangladesh to as much as 14% of GDP in Tuvalu in the Pacific. So the uh, the final dimension in terms of how much was the health spending as a share of government expenditure. This ranged from about 1% in Equatorial Guinea to about 35% in Marshall Islands. So again, showing how much diversity it is. And uh, uh, in that context, just coming back and trying to see that uh, the correlation of the spending with UHC is not that straightforward, with the model used is not that straightforward. However, there were large gains in UHC in the developing countries in East Asia in the recent decades. So, trying to bring our focus closer home. The if you look at the total um, uh, service coverage, the service coverage in East Asia and Pacific has been improving substantially from the 2000 to 2010 to 2017. And as you would remember, that this is one of the two important dimensions of the UHC definition and is reported regularly in the form of a global monitoring report by the World Health Organization and the World Bank. So there has been an improvement in the service coverage index, and it is for the developing East Asia now closer to two-thirds uh, as compared to uh, somewhere around uh, zero point 0.4 or less in 2000. So there has been a very significant jump in the developing East Asia. The jump in Pacific is a bit smaller. It's still in the range of zero point 0.5 as the total index today in the Pacific region. And if you look at the per capita spending on health in the developing East Asia, we find that a lot of people have now lesser amount of catastrophic health expenditure, which we define as more than 10% of household budget being spent out of pocket. In Indonesia, this reduced from 3.5% in 2009 to 2.7% in 2018, and likewise significant reductions in Vietnam and Cambodia as well. So there is a reduction in the household spending a lot of money. And also, if you look at the distribution between public and out of pocket expenditure, a public has significantly taken over the share of out of pocket expenditure in developing East Asia right since about 2005, when these were about equal, and about one third or so of the total amount of health spending. So this is certainly a much better situation to be in. However, COVID is changing things. A deep global contraction is occurring. If you look at the estimates for per capita GDP growth, uh, and you look at history uh, of per capita GDP growth actuals until 2018 or so, and then projections beyond that, we find that the there were significant dips in our region during the Asian financial crisis, and growth really faltered. During the global financial crisis in 2008, there was a much bigger global contraction, and economies really went down into the negative. And then, if you see what's happening now with COVID in 2020, that we call it the Great Lockdown, this is much, much more severe, much deeper in most of the regions of the world and most of the countries, and particularly the highest income countries are the most affected. As you can see, the blue line of the high income countries is showing some of the steepest dips and will take some of the longest time to recover. Likewise, if you see the right hand panel, the if you look at the average per capita GDP across all the low income countries, from a level of $728, it will go down to about $699, which was the same level that we saw in 2015. And it will take perhaps another 5 years or 4 years to come back and bounce back to the level that was being seen even in COVID-19. So the world has really lost already, with the current estimates, some 4 to 5 years of economic growth, and it may be something that could be a changing number again as we understand the implications of COVID and as uh, we try to see how long the situation is going to take. There's a lot of collateral damage that happened. It was not just because of the health causes, the increased unemployment, the increased poverty rates, the negative effect on global remittances and receiving money from the country's citizens working in other countries, reduced household incomes, increasing income inequality, a lot of reduction in consumption, and uh, this has all meant that some of the most vulnerable people, some of the poorest and those in the informal sector, have been impacted the hardest during this deep global contraction. If you look at the East Asian Pacific region, this economic contagion has continued to affect us as well. There are two panels here: the developing East Asian countries, developing countries in East Asia, excluding the high-income countries, and in the Pacific Island economies. About 4/5 of all EAP countries, including all the Pacific Island countries, are expected to actually contract in 2020. And you can see in the slide only Vietnam, China, and Myanmar will show some economic growth, and that may also be much lower than we would have expected from the past trends. The extent of economic distress that has been felt by the countries is very variable and is actually not very correlated with how much of the health impact COVID-19 created in the country. For example, in many Pacific countries, there was very little impact of COVID-19 from a health perspective, but the economic impact, which was a lot more dependent on how was the containment carried out and the degree of external exposure that the countries had in terms of their dependence on international trade, tourism, remittances, etc., have created this scenario. And the prospects for recovery are quite mixed. This is dependent on how quickly domestic economic activity can pick up, how quickly trade can pick up, and though it may take much longer, when does tourism pick up, and when do investments pick up again. Also, they depend to some extent on the availability and delivery of an effective vaccine, continued treatment, continued containment, all the measures that we would need, not just one of these, but all of them taken together to limit the impact. So the implications that this situation creates on universal health coverage really depend on many factors. The pandemic itself and its prevention and treatment measures, then the lockdown, and then the economic crisis that we are seeing because of COVID, which is reflected as the overall reduction in GDP, the increased unemployment, lower remittances, and the likely increase in poverty. So, looking at some of the combined effect of the pandemic and the social distancing, there is a major impact on the supply of health services. So, a lot of health facilities were disrupted because non-COVID services were not as much a priority than containing COVID, at least for the initial period. And then a lot of adjustments were made in how these facilities work to limit the spread of the disease and to be responsible in terms of social distancing. And all of that has really had its own effect. And then the demand for health services also changed. There is increased utilization of COVID, which meant that there were more hospitalization related to COVID, and that reduced the space for other non-COVID services. But also there was a lot of fear and reduction in mobility and difficulty in finding public transport and many other factors that have led to a decline in utilization. Other determinants of health that have also changed. Yes, there is some change and a favorable change in air pollution, maybe a favorable change in road traffic accidents for now, but there would be an increase in mental health issues and domestic abuse. There is also the advantage of now improved hygiene, but then what are the impacts of face masks? All of these are also going to take the shape and size in determining how does health get impacted in its service delivery, in its governance, in its financing, and in the multi-sectoral determinants. And then these factors are also impacted by the economic crisis issues. How is the household income? Are they able to afford receiving healthcare or even the incidental costs? What is the government able to spend on healthcare? How much is the external financing now available for healthcare? What is happening to the social health insurance contributions and private insurance contributions? All of this comes together in how the health outputs, outcomes, and financial protection are likely to change. So a slowdown or a contraction in health financing is definitely expected. Even though there is currently more money for health, a lot of that is currently used for COVID response and in the near future may be used for vaccination. And though governments are trying to increase total government spending to respond to COVID, and they are increasing their borrowing to be able to do that response, the future may require uh, uh, more care on this front. Plus, there will be cost of the servicing of the debt that is going to come. And on one hand, health share of public spending should increase to maintain the previous trend and to offset the likely decline that is going to happen in the out-of-pocket spending. But in reality, the ability to do that may be very difficult, and fiscal tightening may continue by across sectors for several years after the crisis. And this is going to have long-term effects on the health sector. As you can see, the graph is showing that some of the projections after the great lockdown, the out of pocket may decline for some time and it will then start rising again. But the public spending on health, as we can see, should ideally increase to sort of compensate for what is the reduction in the out of pocket, but it may not do so given the challenges of fiscal space. And the consequence may be foregone care or not having adequate care being available, which itself will have its own consequences in terms of long-term costs. Though this may be known to many of us that health service coverage has declined in this year, some of the indications that we can see from available data are disruptions in immunization coverage, for example. Immunization activities were disrupted in many countries, and you can see some examples on the screen. I will not go through the examples, but we have also a lot of emerging data from UNICEF and the WHO that is confirming some of these numbers. Hospitalizations have also declined. If you look at data coming from Philippines and Vietnam, overall hospitalizations have declined. And the most common cited reason for decline in utilization is said to be patients are not coming, patients not present, but then not being available, human resources not being available, clinical staff being taken away for COVID-19 response is clearly another factor. Several other services, non-communicable diseases, rehabilitation, antenatal care are some of the most impacted. And there is also a concern on nutrition, particularly because declining incomes and reducing access to services may lead to continued challenge with undernutrition, and stunting and wasting may increase. Impoverishment due to out-of-pocket expenditure is likely to increase. The Global Monitoring Report on Financial Protection had estimated that 15% of the total poverty was attributable to out-of-pocket expenditures on health. And a large proportion of the population that faces the financial risk of out-of-pocket expenditure are the poor who are being pushed further below into extreme poverty. So they are sinking further. And we can see that this is going to be an increasing number based on the current projections. Both poverty and extreme poverty are likely to increase. The change in the number of poor in China and the rest of East Asia and Pacific is shown in the panel coming from the very recent East Asia and Pacific Economic Update in October. And as we can see from a pre-COVID scenario where in China poverty was expected to reduce by 25%, it will now reduce uh, somewhere between 8 and 10%, or between 8.1 and 9.6%. So far lesser reduction in poverty in China. But if you look at the rest of East Asia and Pacific, from a pre-COVID estimate of 8% reduction in the number of poor, we are now looking at from a 9.5 to 12.6% increase in the number of poor. So this is certainly something that is pushing back our fight against poverty by several years once again. So it is important in this context to be able to inform our policymakers and to make advocacy efforts around the three bi-directional relationships that happen. There is a very strong link of our investments in health systems and how well health systems work to the health outcomes that we achieve. That is something that most health sector policymakers do know. But then there are also very strong relationships between health outcomes and health systems with the economy. These are relationships that we need to make sure that we are able to uh, uh, not only understand better but also explain better. And at that crux will lie our efficacy in making the case for maintaining the investments in health, particularly maintaining the investments in essential health services, and not let them falter, not let the gains in health systems be lost to the extent we can through that advocacy. So, how do health outcomes impact the economy? As we improve fertility and lower child mortality, we find children have better school attendance, better cognitive capacity. There's a better ratio of workers to dependent. We have better labor productivity. We have a larger labor force because people are surviving more and are able to retire later. And with improved adult health and nutrition, and with increasing access to natural resources in the global economy and increased investment in physical capital, all of that together contributes to this increased labor productivity, out of which improved adult health and nutrition is our sector's contribution. And then all this translates into higher GDP per capita. And that's the centrality of how health outcomes impact the economy, and why improving health outcomes is a good investment. If you look at uh, uh, the East Asia miracle of 1965 to 1990, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that health and demography explain a large part of the miracle in our region. It's also very well known that improvements in child health and nutrition are associated with higher earnings and better income in adult life, and significantly more income throughout adult life. There was also evidence around deworming and iron supplementation, improving school attendance and improving learning outcomes. And healthier workers, of course, are more productive and they can earn more. An increase in life expectancy has also been associated with increased foreign direct investment. There are many other detailed arguments on this, which are being made available as part of the work that we are doing in the Domestic Resource Mobilization Collaborative of the JLN. One important effort there is the messaging guide on making the case for health, which is a compilation of such key messages and many references that can be used for further reading, that can be used to make the case for DRM and health, particularly in these post-COVID situations. It explores country cases and practitioner-led tips on communicating effectively, focused on our health policy makers and how they can make the case to the finance policy makers. There are other products coming from the JLN DRM collaborative, a policy dialogue toolkit, tested materials that have been used in the toolkit, which can be used in this policy dialogue, narrative summaries about individual countries, analyzing country budgetary data and seeing how different factors change the funding for health in each of those countries. And more countries are now working on these narrative summaries. So please do look at the JLN website for narrative summaries as they keep coming. An inventory of what innovative domestic resource mobilization efforts have been done in other countries, linking up to the other such information and resources to find out more. and which can be used as precedents and for ideas and for inspiration. Uh, Likewise, we are also trying to understand reprioritization better and have developed a methodology to identify countries that have successfully and systematically given more priority to health. And this will then be led this will further lead to more detailed work on these reprioritization case studies by the collaborative in the coming years. In the same snapshot, it will be important to not forget our focus on efficiency. The JLN Efficiency Collaborator has also several products that will be very useful in this context of the situation created by COVID on health financing. A health priority setting and resource allocation tool and database can capture how our priorities are established and how systematic these are, and can capture how these change over time, benchmarking over time and across countries. And this would be a good time to see how we can capture today's resource allocation environment and compare that to what may happen in a few years. Another product is a practitioner's handbook on health priority setting, which has practical guidance on how countries can make better use of data and evidence to do health sector resource allocations more systematically. So, in a context where we are facing less resources, making sure that the decision on what does not get funded does not happen by default, does not happen by accident, but happens by having thought through with evidence and systematically on what are priorities to be first considered and invested in, and what can be less a risk if not spent for a year or two. Uh, a very important third product from the efficiency collaborative is being able to measure and benchmark efficiency in low and middle income countries. This outlines a benchmarking plus approach that can be used to capture health system performance routinely from an efficiency perspective. It has more than 30 indicator reference fact sheets that help us understand the indicator and where the sources of data are, and then being able to measure these and compare these with other countries and within our own country from time to time. Once again, a very important resource that is useful in a time where we may have to understand the scope for efficiency in our whole health system, and being able to generate some of that efficiency gain to create resources for our upcoming needs. So, on that note, I would like to thank you for your patient hearing, and once again, all the best wishes to the rest of the course. Thank you very much.